Hey, story lovers! Welcome back to Bella Stories, where I bring the most fascinating tales right to your screen. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe and turn on that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on any of my stories. The courtroom fell silent. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Judge Emily Grant's eyes burned with an intensity that could cut through steel. She stood tall, her black robe flowing like a shadow around her. Her voice was cold, steady, and filled with authority. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her words echoing off the walls, "you have 5 seconds to rise and show respect to this court." Jason Thompson, the billionaire tech mogul known for his arrogance, sat comfortably in his chair, legs crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips. He didn't even flinch. His piercing blue eyes stared back at Judge Grant with defiance. "I don't stand for anyone, especially not for a woman in a robe," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Gasps filled the room, and the court reporter nearly dropped her pen. The guards at the door stiffened, readying themselves for what might come next. Judge Grant's jaw tightened. Her fingers gripped the gavel so hard her knuckles turned white. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Jason's. "Mr. Thompson, you are now in contempt of court." Her words were sharp, like shards of glass. Jason's smile widened as if he had just won some twisted game. "Add it to my tab," he said with a mocking laugh. The room was frozen, tension crackling in the air. Judge Grant's face remained calm, but her eyes burned with resolve. "Bailiff," she called, her voice unyielding. "Remove Mr. Thompson from my courtroom, by force if necessary." The guards moved toward Jason, who didn't even bother to stand. He looked up at them, his arrogance unshaken. "Touch me, and I'll have your jobs by the end of the day," he warned. But the guards hesitated for only a moment. Judge Grant's stare was as fierce as a storm, and they knew better than to disobey her order. Just as the guards grabbed his arms, Jason's grin vanished. His face twisted with fury. "You can't do this. I own half this city," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room as they dragged him out. Judge Grant watched him struggle, her face like stone. But behind her calm exterior, her mind was racing. She knew this was just the beginning. Jason Thompson wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. There would be consequences. The courtroom was left buzzing with whispers and shock. No one had ever seen anyone defy Judge Grant like that, let alone a billionaire who thought he was above the law. But she wouldn't back down. She never did. Jason Thompson was about to learn that no amount of money could buy respect, or justice. Earlier that morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras flashing as Jason Thompson entered, dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. He walked with his chin high, his posture screaming confidence. To him, this was just another show, a chance to prove his power and influence. The case was about corporate fraud. Jason was accused of cheating thousands of people out of their life savings. But his high-priced lawyers were known for making problems disappear. He had already walked out of several lawsuits without a scratch, and this time, he expected no different. When Judge Grant entered the room, everyone stood out of respect, everyone except Jason. He remained seated, scrolling through his phone as if he were bored. His lawyer nudged him, whispering urgently, but Jason waved him off. "I don't stand for anyone," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. They looked at him in shock, but he didn't care. To him, rules were for other people, not for billionaires. Judge Grant's eyes flicked to him as she took her seat. Her expression remained neutral, but she had noticed his defiance. She had heard the rumors about Jason Thompson, the way he treated people, the way he believed his wealth made him untouchable. But in her courtroom, everyone was equal under the law. And she intended to make him understand that. As the trial began, Jason continued to show his contempt. He smirked as the prosecutor presented evidence, whispering jokes to his lawyer. When witnesses spoke about losing their life savings, he rolled his eyes, tapping his fingers impatiently. It was clear he didn't care. To him, this was all just noise, a minor inconvenience. But Judge Grant was watching him closely, her patience wearing thin. She saw the way he sneered at the victims, the way he acted as if he were above them all. It was then that she made a decision. Jason Thompson needed a lesson in respect, one that he would never forget. As the day went on, Jason's arrogance only grew. When the court took a break, he didn't bother to stand when Judge Grant left the room. When they returned, he was the last to sit, dragging out the moment just to show he was in control. His lawyer kept sweating, whispering for him to show some respect, but Jason ignored him. Then came the moment that changed everything. The prosecutor was wrapping up his argument when Jason's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, typing a message right there at the defense table. The prosecutor stopped, his eyes wide with disbelief. The jury stared, whispering among themselves. Judge Grant's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice sharp, "this is a court of law, not your office. Put that phone away." Jason looked up, unfazed. "I'm busy," he replied, not even bothering to look at her. A hush fell over the room. No one moved, no one spoke. Judge Grant's face hardened. She had given him enough chances. It was time to make him understand the meaning of respect. She rose to her feet, her robe flowing behind her like a shadow. "Mr. Thompson, rise when you address this court," she commanded, her voice echoing with authority. But Jason didn't move. He just sat there, his smile smug, his eyes challenging her. "I don't stand for anyone," he said again, his voice filled with defiance. The room held its breath, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Judge Grant's eyes blazed with fury. Her voice was ice-cold when she spoke. "Then I have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Jason leaned back, his grin wide. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Do your worst." The courtroom was electrified, everyone leaning forward, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Grant's face was stone, her resolve unshakable. She lifted her gavel, her eyes locked on Jason. And then, in a voice as cold as winter, she delivered the order that shocked everyone. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Thompson from my courtroom, by force if necessary." The guards moved in, and Jason's arrogant smile began to fade. He struggled as they grabbed his arms, his voice rising in anger. "You can't do this. I'll ruin you," he shouted, his face twisted with rage. But Judge Grant remained calm, her eyes never leaving him. The doors slammed shut as Jason was dragged out, his shouts echoing down the hall. The room was left in stunned silence, the tension still heavy in the air. Judge Grant took her seat, her face composed. But inside, she knew this was far from over. Jason Thompson wouldn't let this go. He was too powerful, too proud. And she had just made an enemy out of one of the most dangerous men in the city. What would he do next? What consequences would follow? As the courtroom slowly returned to order, one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. The courtroom doors flew open as Jason Thompson was dragged out, his furious shouts echoing down the marble hallway. His expensive shoes scraped against the floor as he struggled, his face red with anger. "You idiots! Do you have any idea who I am?" he yelled, his voice bouncing off the walls. The guards didn't respond. They kept their grips firm on his arms, hauling him out of Judge Grant's courtroom. Inside, the room was still buzzing with whispers. No one could believe what had just happened. Jason Thompson, the untouchable billionaire, had been thrown out like a common criminal. And by a female judge no less. Reporters scribbled furiously, their minds already crafting headlines. The jury sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Judge Emily Grant remained calm, her face composed. But behind her steely expression, her heart raced. She knew she had just made a powerful enemy. Jason Thompson was not the type of man who accepted defeat quietly. She could already imagine the phone calls he was making, the strings he was pulling. but she couldn't allow fear to control her. In her courtroom, justice was blind to wealth and power. No exceptions. She cleared her throat, bringing the room back to order. "We will proceed with the trial," she announced, her voice steady. "The defendant has been removed for contempt of court, but the case against him stands. Continue with the next witness." The prosecutor rose, a satisfied glint in his eyes. Jason's arrogance had played right into his hands. Outside, Jason was thrown into a holding cell, his hair messy, his suit wrinkled. He paced back and forth, his fists clenched. "This is a joke," he muttered, his eyes blazing with rage. "I'll ruin her. I'll ruin them all." He grabbed his phone, dialing his lawyer. "I want her career over. Do you hear me? I want Judge Emily Grant destroyed." His lawyer's nervous voice crackled through the phone. "Jason, she's a respected judge. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Jason shouted, his voice echoing in the empty cell. "Get me out of here. Now." His lawyer sighed, already exhausted. "I'll see what I can do." The call ended, and Jason's eyes narrowed. He wasn't just going to get out. He was going to make Judge Grant pay. Meanwhile, Judge Grant continued with the trial, her focus unshaken. Witness after witness testified about Jason's schemes, how he tricked people into investing in fake projects, how he used his charm to gain trust, then stole their life savings. The jury listened closely, their expressions growing more serious with every story. By the end of the day, the prosecutor rested his case. The evidence was overwhelming. But Judge Grant knew it wouldn't be enough to bring Jason down. He was smart, powerful, and ruthless. If they were going to convict him, they needed something more. Something that would break through his armor of arrogance. As she adjourned the court for the day, her clerk approached, worry written all over her face. "Judge Grant, there's something you need to see," she whispered, handing over a letter. It was folded neatly, Jason Thompson's name printed at the top. But it wasn't just any letter. It was a threat. The words were written in bold, sharp letters: "You made a mistake, Judge Grant. Nobody humiliates me. Nobody." Her eyes scanned the page, her jaw tightening. She knew Jason was behind this. She could feel his anger radiating off the paper. But she wouldn't let him intimidate her. She wouldn't let him win. That night, as she walked to her car, she noticed a black SUV parked nearby. Its windows were tinted, its engine running. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her pace steady, her chin held high. She wouldn't show fear, not even when she felt eyes watching her every move. She reached her car and got in, locking the doors quickly. But as she turned the key, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You really think you can beat me? This isn't over." Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the parking lot. The SUV was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She knew Jason was playing mind games, trying to scare her. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. Jason Thompson was back, his lawyer by his side. He walked in like nothing had happened, his head held high, his confidence unbroken. His eyes locked with Judge Grant's, and his lips curled into a smug smile. It was a challenge, a silent promise of revenge. Judge Grant met his gaze, her expression cold and unwavering. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice steady, "I trust you will show proper respect today." Jason's smile grew wider. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But Judge Grant could see the anger behind his eyes, the rage simmering beneath his calm facade. He wasn't done fighting. Not even close. The trial continued, witness after witness exposing Jason's lies. But his lawyer was clever, twisting words, creating doubt. By lunchtime, the jury looked confused, their confidence shaken. Judge Grant watched, her frustration growing. Jason was trying to manipulate the system, just as he always had. But she wouldn't let him. During the break, she reviewed the evidence, searching for the key that would break his defense. And then she found it, a document buried beneath a pile of papers. It was a contract, one that proved Jason's involvement beyond any doubt. Her heart raced. This was it. This was what they needed to bring him down. But as she prepared to present it in court, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number: "You're making a big mistake. Walk away while you still can." She looked up, her eyes scanning the room. Jason was watching her, his smile cold and calculating. He knew she had found something. He knew she was close to winning. And he was prepared to do anything to stop her. Judge Grant felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She wouldn't let fear control her. She wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. She walked back into the courtroom, her shoulders squared, her face set with determination. "The court will now resume," she announced, her voice firm. Jason's eyes followed her every move, his smile never fading. But behind that smile was a darkness, a promise of revenge. She presented the contract, her voice steady as she explained its significance. The jury leaned in, their eyes wide with realization. Jason's face turned pale, his confidence cracking. For the first time, he looked worried. But then, just as victory seemed within reach, the courtroom doors burst open. A man rushed in, his face pale with fear. He whispered urgently to the bailiff, who immediately ran to Judge Grant's side. "There's been an accident, your car, it exploded in the parking lot." The room gasped, heads turning to stare at Jason, who was smiling once again, his eyes cold as ice. Judge Grant felt her heart skip a beat, her hands trembling. This was his warning, his way of showing her who was in control. She looked at him, her eyes blazing with defiance. He wouldn't scare her. He wouldn't win. But as the shock settled over the courtroom, she realized just how far Jason Thompson was willing to go. This wasn't just about a trial anymore. This was a war. And she had just become his #1 enemy. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence, the news of the explosion hanging heavy in the air. Judge Grant's face remained calm, but inside, her heart was pounding. She looked at Jason, whose cold smile sent a chill down her spine. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, as if daring her to back down. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "We will take a short recess," she announced, her voice steady. "Court will resume in 15 minutes. She stood up, her steps firm as she exited the room, her head held high. But as soon as she was out of sight, her hands began to tremble. Her car. Her own car had been blown up. If she had left the courthouse a minute earlier. She shook off the thought, refusing to give in to fear. This was Jason's game. He was trying to scare her, to make her quit. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. In her chambers, Detective Harris was waiting, his face grim. "Judge Grant, we've secured the parking lot. No one was hurt, but this was no accident. The bomb was placed directly under your car." She swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. "He did this," she said, her voice cold. "Jason Thompson. He's trying to intimidate me." Harris nodded. "We're looking into it. But he's smart. Nothing ties him to the scene. Whoever did this knew exactly how to cover their tracks." Judge Grant's eyes burned with anger. Jason thought he was untouchable, above the law. But she was going to prove him wrong. "Increase security. I don't want him or anyone else thinking they can get away with this." Harris nodded. "We'll keep you safe, Judge. I promise." She straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "I don't need protection. I need justice. Make sure that trial continues. I want Jason Thompson convicted." 15 minutes later, she was back on the bench, her face a mask of calm determination. The jury filed in, whispering among themselves. They had heard about the explosion. They were nervous, their eyes flicking to Jason, who sat relaxed, his smile never fading. Judge Grant looked at him, her eyes cold as ice. "Court is now in session," she declared. "Mr. Thompson, I trust you are ready to proceed?" Jason stood, his confidence unshaken. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied smoothly. "I hope you weren't too shaken by recent events." His eyes gleamed with malice, his meaning clear. She refused to react, her face remaining composed. "Your concern is noted, Mr. Thompson. Let's continue with the cross-examination." She gestured to the prosecutor, who stood up, his shoulders squared. The next witness was brought in, a former employee of Jason's company. She looked nervous, her hands twisting in her lap. But as she began to speak, her voice grew stronger. She told the court about Jason's manipulative tactics, his threats to anyone who questioned him. Jason's lawyer tried to discredit her, accusing her of lying out of revenge. But Judge Grant wouldn't allow it. "Stick to the facts," she ordered, her tone firm. She wasn't going to let Jason bully his way out of this. Not in her courtroom. The day dragged on, the tension in the room growing thicker. Jason's lawyer fought hard, twisting words, planting doubts. But the witnesses were strong, their stories consistent. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, revealing Jason's web of lies and deceit. But just when it seemed like the case was turning against him, Jason played his final card. His lawyer called a surprise witness, Jason's personal assistant, a woman named Laura who had been by his side for years. She took the stand, her face pale, her eyes refusing to meet Judge Grant's gaze. Under oath, she testified that Jason was innocent, that all the accusations were lies made up by jealous competitors. Her words were firm, rehearsed. But there was something off about her, a nervous tremor in her voice. Judge Grant watched her closely, noticing how her hands shook, how her eyes flicked to Jason every few seconds. After she finished, Judge Grant called for a break, her mind racing. She knew Laura was lying. She could see the fear in her eyes. Jason was using her, just as he used everyone else. But proving it would be nearly impossible. As she stepped out of the courtroom, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number: "I told you to walk away. You just don't listen, do you?" She looked around, her eyes scanning the crowded hallway. But there was no sign of Jason. No sign of anyone suspicious. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. He was watching her. He was everywhere. But she wouldn't let him win. She refused to be his victim. If he wanted a war, she would give him one. She would expose his lies, no matter the cost. The next morning, Judge Grant made a bold decision. She ordered Laura back to the stand, her eyes sharp as she began to question her. "Miss Laura, you've worked for Mr. Thompson for years. You must know his business very well." Laura nodded, her face pale. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Grant leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Then can you explain why your signature appears on this contract?" She held up the document she had found, the one that proved Jason's guilt. "This contract ties Mr. Thompson directly to the fraud. And you signed it as a witness." Laura's eyes widened, her face draining of color. She looked at Jason, who was glaring at her, his jaw clenched. Her hands began to shake, her lips trembling. I didn't know. He told me it was just paperwork." Judge Grant's voice softened, her eyes locking onto Laura's. "He made you sign it, didn't he? He used you to cover his tracks." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes. Her shoulders sagged, her defenses crumbling. "Yes. He threatened me. He said if I didn't do what he asked, I'd lose everything." The courtroom gasped, heads turning to Jason, whose face was red with rage. He stood up, his voice booming. "She's lying. This is all lies." Judge Grant's gavel slammed down, her voice sharp. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson. You will not intimidate anyone in my courtroom. Jason's eyes blazed with fury, but he sank back into his chair, his fists clenched. His perfect facade was falling apart, his lies unraveling. He looked at Judge Grant, his face twisted with hate. You think you've won? He hissed, his voice low and dangerous. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Judge Grant met his gaze, her expression unyielding. Threats won't save you, Mr. Thompson. Justice will be served. The jury watched, their faces grim. Jason's empire of lies was crumbling before their eyes. And Judge Grant stood firm, unshaken, her resolve stronger than ever. But as the verdict was announced, guilty on all charges, Jason's smile returned. You'll regret this, he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. You'll regret crossing me. Judge Grant felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to show fear. She had won the battle. But the war was far from over. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Grant stood tall, watching as Jason Thompson was led away in handcuffs. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes never leaving hers. She knew his threat was real, but she refused to let it shake her. Justice had been served, and she had done her duty. Detective Harris approached, his face a mixture of relief and concern. He won't forget this, Judge. Men like him don't let things go easily. Judge Grant nodded, her jaw set with determination. I know. But I won't live my life in fear. The law is meant to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. And today, justice won. Harris gave her a respectful nod. We'll keep an eye on him. If he tries anything, we'll be ready. As she walked to her chambers, she thought of everything Jason had done to try to scare her, from the explosion to the threats. But she hadn't backed down. She wouldn't let fear control her. She entered her office and found a small envelope on her desk. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, her eyes narrowing at the handwritten note inside. This is just the beginning. Judge Grant took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the paper. Jason might be behind bars, but his reach was long. His empire was vast, his power still strong. But she wouldn't be intimidated. She picked up the phone, dialing Harris. Make sure Jason is watched around the clock. And double the security on my family. Harris's voice was firm. Consider it done, Judge. She hung up, her eyes drifting to the window. The city sprawled out before her, bustling with life, unaware of the silent war waging behind closed doors. Jason's fight wasn't over. But neither was hers. Judge Grant knew she had won today's battle, but the war against corruption and greed would never end. Not as long as men like Jason existed. But she was ready. She was strong. She would fight for justice, no matter the cost. As she turned off the lights and walked out of her office, her head held high, she knew one thing for certain, Jason's threats were real. But so was her courage. And no matter what he tried next, she would stand firm. Because in her courtroom, justice would always prevail. And that's it for today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.